Hello, my name's Katie. I'm reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller, and we are on chapter 3, part 2. This is the longest chapter in the whole book. It's 40 or 50 pages, and we're about halfway through. So we're going to start back up with the third gate of grief, the sorrows of the world. The third gate of grief opens when we register the losses of the world around us. Whether or not we consciously recognize it, the daily diminishment of species, habitats, and cultures is noted in our psyches. Much of the grief we carry is not personal but shared, communal. It is difficult to walk down the street and not feel the collective sorrows of homelessness or the economic insanity revealed in commercialism and consumerism. It takes everything we have to deny the sorrows of the world. At nearly every grief ritual, people share their profound sadness for the earth. One woman shared her gratitude for finally having a place to acknowledge in community this grief. They feel what psychologist Chellis Glendinning calls earth grief. She writes, "To open our hearts to the sad history of humanity and the devastated state of the earth is the next step in our reclamation of our bodies, the body of our human community and the body of the earth. This is the gate where we most directly experience the soul of the world, the anima mundi. Here the alchemical observation that the greater part of the soul lies outside the body becomes evident. As Jung noted, we live in psyche. Psyche does not live in us. We are enveloped in a field of consciousness. Everything possesses soul. This was known to every indigenous culture. What we feel from the surrounding world is not a projection of our own minds outward into the environment. We can travel just about anywhere in the world, and we will inevitably come across vestiges of clear cuts, those bleeding and scarred lands that look so desolate and violated. These places announce themselves as a wound, a rupture where life once moved and breathed. Our hearts sink into a deep grief in these times. Western psychology would most likely suggest that the grief we are feeling is related to our own experience of being diminished as a child, a metaphoric clear cut, as it were. In that moment, we would be left alone with our feelings of grief, wondering about how to heal this wound. What if, however, the feelings we have when we pass through these zones of destruction are actually arising from the land itself? What if it is the grief of the forest registering in our bodies and psyches, the sorrow of the redwoods, voles, sorrel, ferns, owls, and deer, all those who lost their homes and live in lives as a result of this plunder of living beings? What if we are not separate from the world at all? It is our spiritual responsibility to acknowledge these losses. What if this is the anima mundi, the soul of the world weeping through us? We know and feel in our bones that something primal is amiss. Our extended home is being eroded, as is the experience of our wider self. It is essential that we stop and recognize these losses. It is good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at these places touched by so much loss. We cringe when we see polluted rivers and litter strewn along roadsides. We felt the sorrows of the Gulf of Mexico as it struggled with the outpouring of oil into its waters. Our souls are connected with the soul of the world, and it is through this bond that we acknowledge our interconnected lives. The cumulative grief of the world is overwhelming. The litany of losses could fill this book. Our ways of living have become corrosive to the earth, to prairie dogs and grizzly bears, to bluefin tuna and monarch butterflies and cultures. Every day we see the dead lying by the side of the road, deer, raccoons, skunks, possums, and foxes. Shopping malls homogenize the landscape of our communities, turning them into a bland slurry. We are depleting with an ever-growing tenacity the complex, multi-layered song of the world and replacing it with a single-pitch monotone depositing empty calories, sterile seeds, and meaningless objects in every developing country while silencing forever the voices of hundreds of cultures. Every few weeks, a language is lost, and along with it, a nuanced imagination of a people who were rooted to a place for perhaps thousands of years. Soon we will be left with only the barest semblance of the exuberant matrix that we once had, as the monoculture of modernity plows into the lives of every culture, replacing their traditions with imitations of our own pale expressions of life. How can we possibly stay open to the endless assaults on the biosphere when the urge to avert our eyes and pretend that we don't feel this pain takes over? It takes a heart of courage and conviction, one willing to look into the center of the suffering and remain present. To live a life of soul means living with sensitivity to the plight of the planet. I think of Rachel Carson, who launched the modern environmental movement with her work on DDT and other toxins. Lily Yeh, rebuilding neighborhoods in the inner city of Philadelphia through programs that bring art and beauty to blighted areas. And Rigoberta Menchú, protecting indigenous communities in Guatemala from corporate incursions. I think of Nemo Bassi, fighting to protect the Niger Delta from oil spills. Nearly every year, the people of Nigeria experience oil spills the size of the Exxon Valdez spill. There are thousands of men and women whose names we will likely never know, who are defending their homelands from the assaults of greed. I have listened to many young men and women share their stories of grief and outrage over the destruction of the world. One young man came to a ritual after spending months on the road fighting for ecological and economic justice as part of the Occupy movement. He wept the most heart-wrenching tears as he expressed his pain for the suffering world. His heart, however, was willing to stay open and register all that is happening in our communities and culture. At another gathering, a woman in her early 30s sat silently, tears streaming down her face. When she spoke, she shared her extreme pain for the world, how it pierced her heart and has shadowed her life with a persistent sorrow. Her faith in our future had been shaken. The entire room was moved by the depth of her pain and her love for the earth. It is imperative that we grant shelter for these young and courageous people working on the front lines of change. I was talking one day with a woman who works with communities around the world on issues of global climate change. She was telling me how much grief she had begun to feel as she travels and witnesses what is happening to people in regions that are already badly affected. She had tears in her eyes as she shared stories of whole cultures that may disappear because of rising sea levels. She was feeling the tears of the world and realized that she needed a place where she could reveal those feelings. She was eager to attend our grief ritual. Walking through the doors of grief brings us into the room of the great grief of the world. Naomi Shihab Nye says it so beautifully in her poem, Kindness. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows, and you see the size of the cloth. The cloth is immense. There we all share the communal cup of loss, and in it we find our deep kinship with one another and the living world. That is the alchemy of grief, the great and abiding ecology of the sacred once again showing us what the indigenous soul has always known. We are of the earth. Another facet of the third gate is the loss of our connection with nature. We no longer live with a sensuous intimacy with the wind, rivers, rainfall, and birdsong. For many of us, the voices of the wild world have faded, receded in mind and imagination. The philosopher Thomas Berry said that we have become autistic to the world and have ceased to register the songs and moods of the singing planet. I'm not sure how I feel about that use of the word autistic. Human biologist Paul Shepard said, the grief and sense of loss that we often interpret as a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. The weight carried by this statement astonishes me. We were meant to have a lifelong engagement with a beautiful and strange otherness. It was meant to be an ongoing presence, not something that we capture on our cameras while on vacation in Yellowstone or something we watch on the Nature Channel. Shepard spoke adamantly and repeatedly about how other creatures shaped us and made us human, how the lessons of coyote and rabbit, mouse and hawk taught us core values and how to live in a sustainable way. Animals were the first thing that we depicted in recesses and cave paintings. The first we conjured in myths and tales. Their ways were integral not only to our survival, but also to the very shaping of our souls. Now, in the shortest wisp of a moment, the perennial conversation has been silenced for the vast majority of us. There are no daily encounters with woods or prairies, with herds of elk or bison, no ongoing connection with manzanita or scrub jays. The myth and stories about the exploits of raven, the courage of mouse, and the cleverness of fox have fallen cold. The others have retreated and have essentially vanished from our attention, our minds, and our imaginations. What happens to our soul life in the absence of the others? Shepard says that what emerges is a grief-laden emptiness. How true. And he was wise to recognize our tendency to attribute the emptiness to a failure in our personality. Often in my practice, I hear someone talk about feeling empty. But what if this emptiness is more akin to what Shepard is suggesting? What if it is a hollowness that comes from a prolonged absence of bird song, the scent of sweetgrass, the taste of wild huckleberries, the cry of the red-tailed hawk, or the melancholy call of the loon? What if this emptiness is the great echo in our soul of what it is we expected and did not receive? We are born, as psychiatrist Artie Lang reminds us, as Stone Age children. Our entire psychic, physical, emotional, and spiritual makeup was shaped in the long evolutionary sweep of our species. Our inheritance includes an intimate and permeable exchange with the wild world. It is what our minds and bodies expect. Eco-psychologist Chellis Glendinning calls this original unfoldment in the natural world the primal matrix. We were embedded in this matrix of life and knew the world and ourselves only through this perception. It was an unmediated intimacy with the living world, with no trace of separation between the human and the more than human world. What was once a seamless embrace has now become a breach, a tear in our sense of belonging. Glendinning calls this our original trauma. This trauma carries with it all the recognizable symptoms associated with psychic injury: chronic anxiety, dissociation, distrust, hypervigilance, disconnection, and many others. We are left with a profound loneliness and isolation that we rarely acknowledge. It is as if we have completely normalized our condition, and yet this feeling of separation profoundly affects the range of our reach, the ways we participate in the landscape, and our sense of allegiance with the living world. Our soul life flickers dimly, and rather than feeling a kinship with the entire breathing world, we inhabit and defend a small shell of a world, occupying our daily life with what linguist David Hinton calls the relentless industry of self. This beautiful and strange otherness was also meant to be seen in one another's eyes. We too are meant to embody a vivid and animated life, to live close to our wild souls, our wild bodies and minds. We are meant to dance and sing, play and laugh unselfconsciously, tell stories, make love, and take delight in this brief but privileged adventure of incarnation. The wild within and the wild without are kin. The one enlivening the other is a beautiful tango. When we pause and allow our separation from the living earth to rise, we feel the grief and sense of loss that Shepard speaks of. When we open ourselves and take in the sorrows of the world, letting them penetrate our insulated hut of the heart, we are both overwhelmed by the grief of the world and in some strange alchemical way reunited with the aching, shimmering body of the planet. We become acutely aware that there is no out there. We have one continuous existence, one shared skin. Our suffering is mutually entangled, the one with the other, as is our healing. I have shared this quote of Shepherd's on many occasions, and there are always tears of recognition. The words are painfully true. We no longer look to the others in the world, and consequently, our souls are diminished. The multicolored world of animals, plants, streams, hills, and sky has faded from our attention. We are suffering from what eco-philosopher Richard Louv calls nature deficit disorder. We have all but forgotten the intimate connection between our breath and the trees, flowering plants, and oceans that offer us their gift of oxygen. We could not exist without this luscious world surrounding our senses with beauty and delight. We would indeed die of a great loneliness without the others with whom we share this animate earth. As eco-philosopher David Abram points out, we have become a single species only talking to itself. We carry a sorrow deep in our bodies for the suffering earth. Remembering our bond with the earth helps heal our bodies and souls. One young woman with whom I worked would consistently deprive herself of good food as if she was not worthy of nourishment. One day I took her hand and led her out into the yard next to the building. I cleared away some leaves and grass, revealing the naked earth. I brought her over and knelt down with her and placed her hands on the ground, and I asked her to tell the earth about her struggle with food. A torrent of tears unleashed her grief about her feelings of worthlessness. Her tears fell to the earth, and she felt the benevolent pulse of the ground beneath her hands. This was a moment of healing through the grace of the indigenous soul knowing its deep affiliation with this world. Her relationship to her own soul was reestablished, and she is now the loving mother of her own beautiful, well-fed daughter. This sweet medicine is available to each of us, offered by the earth without reservation or deserving. You don't have to earn this grace. It is not a reward for doing something right. It is a matter of recognizing and feeling the fullness of this constant connection. Our welcome is not predicated on measuring up to a standard. It is a matter of intimacy, of relationship with the world as it is. There is a ritual that my community does annually called Renewing the World, in which we communally address the earth's need to be fed and replenished. The ritual lasts 3 days, and we begin with a funeral to acknowledge all that is leaving the world. We build a pyre, and then together we name and place onto the fire what we have lost. We place there the deaths of family members, the loss of things like mercy, democracy, and justice, the deaths of rivers and old-growth forests, of manatees and wetlands. The first time we did this ritual, I was planning on drumming and holding the space for others. I made an invocation to the sacred, and when the last word left my mouth, I was pulled to my knees by the weight of my grief for the world. I sobbed and sobbed for each loss named, and I knew in my body that each of these losses had been registered by my soul, even though I never knew it consciously. For 4 hours, we shared this space together, and then we ended in silence, acknowledging the deep losses in our world. The fourth gate, what we expected and did not receive. There is another gate to grief, one difficult to identify, yet is very present in each of our lives. This threshold into sorrow calls forward the things that we may not even realize we have lost. I have written elsewhere about the expectations coded into our physical and psychic lives. When we are born, and as we pass through childhood, adolescence, and the stages of adulthood, we are designed to anticipate a certain quality of welcome, engagement, touch, and reflection. In short, we expect what our deep-time ancestors experienced as their birthright, namely the container of the village. We are born expecting a rich and sensuous relationship with the earth and communal rituals of celebration, grief, and healing that keep us in connection with the sacred. As T.S. Eliot wrote in The Wasteland, once upon a time we knew the world from birth. This is our inheritance, our birthright, which has been lost and abandoned. The absence of these requirements haunt us, even if we can't give them a name and we feel their loss as an ache, a vague sadness that settles over us like a fog. This lack is simultaneously one of the primary sources of our grief and one of the reasons we find it difficult to grieve. On some level, we are waiting for the village to appear so we can fully acknowledge our sorrows. How do we even know that we miss these experiences? I don't know how to answer that question. What I do know is that when these things are finally granted to us, a wave of recognition rises that we have lived without this love, this acknowledgement, and this support of this village all our lives. This realization calls forth grief. I have seen this time and time again. One participant in a grief ritual said, "Thank you for opening a door for us that we didn't even know was there." At the core of this grief is our longing to belong. This longing is wired into us by necessity. It assures our safety and our ability to extend out into the world with confidence. This feeling of belonging is rooted in the village and at times in extended families. It was in this setting that we emerged as a species. It was in this setting that It was in this setting that we emerged as a species. It was in this setting that what we required to become fully human was established. Jean Liedloff writes, "The design of each individual was a reflection of the experience it expected to encounter. We are designed to receive touch, to hear sounds and words entering our ears that soothe and comfort. We are shaped for closeness and for intimacy with our surroundings. Our profound feelings of lacking something are not a reflection of a personal failure, but the reflection of a society that has failed to offer us what we were designed to expect." Laidlaw concludes, "What was once man's confident expectation for suitable treatment and surroundings is now so frustrated that a person often thinks himself lucky if he is not actually homeless or in pain. But even as he is saying, 'I am all right,' there is in him a sense of loss, a longing for something he cannot name, a feeling of being off-center, of missing something. Ask point blank, he will seldom deny it." I remember vividly my experience in Maladoma Some's village of Deno in Burkina Faso in West Africa. I felt pangs of envy when every night near dusk people would gather in the common area and share their day. This is when we have happy hour in our culture, drinks at half price. Perhaps this is how we anesthetize our loss. In Deno, there was food and millet beer, stories, laughter, and tears. It was thick with a feeling of welcome. Children were there as well, weaving in and out of conversations, playing until they lay down and drifted to sleep, filled with the sounds of their families and community which lapped in their ears like waves on a beach. They were not segregated from the world of the adults. If a child was hungry and was nursing, any mother with milk offered her breast to the child. It took me days to figure out who exactly was the child of whom. Imagine how profoundly that would impact us if we knew that we were welcome in any home and could find sustenance at any fire. This has a lasting effect on the psyche. The children I met were generally happy, engaged, and curious, and they displayed a certain confidence. They knew that they were a welcomed part of the village. It was clear to me that what we long for and what we need is the fulfillment of these primary satisfactions. This nightly ritual was in stark contrast to Western culture. We tend to spend our nights separated from one another. Our storyteller is the television or the internet, and children are hustled off to bed to follow some regimented idea of bedtime. After all, they have schedules to follow. We often go entire days with only the barest connections with one another, with the earth, with ourselves. We are busy people. What I felt in the people of Deno was a deep sense that they knew their worth and their welcome. These two things are extensions of one another, worth and welcome. There wasn't any anxiety of whether someone was good enough to be let inside the circle. This was a given. And don't hear this as some altruistic practice. The generation of healthy and contented people was a necessity for the sustainability of the village. Everyone was needed, therefore their well-being was essential. A healthy village requires healthy individuals, and to become a healthy individual, you need a healthy village. They are mirrors of one another, the one supporting the other. I wrote earlier about shame and how this toxic emotion situates itself in us as a consequence of an inadequate sense of belonging. Here is a story that beautifully illustrates the link between belonging and how vulnerable we become to shame saturating our psyches. While I was in Maladoma's village, I met a young woman about 17 years old with an extensive burn scar across her face. This did not seem to make her self-conscious. Quite the contrary, she was ebullient, happy, and outgoing. One day I asked Maladoma about the scar. He said it was terrible. Her mother threw boiling water on her in a fit of rage. I asked what happened after that. He said the village responded immediately and let this girl know that what happened had nothing to do with her, that her mother was wrong to do this, and that she was loved and cherished by the people. At that point, I understood something critical about belonging and shame. Many of us have had experiences of violation and injury, not unlike this woman. The difference between her experience and ours is that she had a village that immediately responded and dissipated the pain of a shameful act. In other words, what occurred to her remained superficial. It did not penetrate beyond the skin and become part of her story. She carries a scar, but her soul is intact. Her village could see her value and helped her to remember her essence. Without a village to reflect back to us that we are valued, these ruptures are interpreted in silence, in a vacuum, and the conclusion we often come to is, I must have deserved this treatment, or I was somehow responsible for this. I hear versions of this story often in my practice. Another facet of loss at this gate concerns the expectation of purpose in our lives. Deep in our bones lies an intuition that we arrive here carrying a bundle of gifts to offer to the community. Over time, these gifts are meant to be seen, developed, and called into the village at times of need. To feel value for the gifts with which we are born affirms our worth and dignity. In a sense, it is a form of spiritual employment. Simply being who we are confirms our place in the village. That is one of the fundamental understandings about gifts. We can only offer them by being fully ourselves. Gifts are a consequence of authenticity. When we are being true to our natures, the gifts can emerge. In our modern culture of hyperactivity and stress, we are seldom asked what we have carried into the world as a gift for the community. The frequent question is, what do you do for a living? Or worse, how do you earn a living? I find that question obscene. We have gone from being seen as valuable to the community, a carrier of gifts, to having to earn a living. No one asks, what is the gift you carry in your soul? What have you brought with you into the heart of the village? We long to feel cosmically significant, that it matters that we are here and that we make a difference. Like the Pueblo Indians who know it is their cosmic duty to sing the sun up every day, we also long to feel that we are needed to keep the whole wild spinning world happening. The absence of this remains as a persistent grief in our psyches. We have become spiritually unemployed. Hidden within the losses at this gate lies our diminished experience of who we truly are. Our experience of identity has been radically reduced over the centuries, especially in Western technological cultures. What was once a seamless intermingling of body, family, community, clan, ecology, and cosmos has been reduced to a narrow realm where we live as an isolated cell, occasionally colliding with other isolated cells. Widespread feelings of loneliness are a reflection of this rupture in our greater identity. This passage from Sigmund Freud acknowledges the loss while at the same time normalizing the state as the consequence of living in modern culture. He wrote, originally the ego includes everything. Later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a once intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. Whenever I talk about this loss with groups of people, there is a feeling of surprise and then sadness. They quickly realize that their experience of who they are has been compromised. What was meant to be a far-ranging identity riddled with intimacies with wild iris, stellar clusters, earthworms, and humans has been whittled down to the narrowest hub. We exist in a state of isolation, cut off from an encompassing community of others. We often feel flattened under the weight of domestication, which smothers the heat and howl of our wild selves. We feel eviscerated, made tame by rules and conditioning that blanket the world with uniformity and mediocrity. This reduction in vitality and vividness induces a smoldering rage. Domestication mutes the poetry and music of the world, crushing the articulated and nuanced rhythms that accompany all living things, what poet Federico Garcia Lorca called the canto hondo, the deep song of the world, and we are emptied. In a somewhat humorous fashion, Michael Ventura speaks to the reduction in identity. He writes, "You are not one person. You are many people. You are a community of moods and selves under one name. Parts of you aren't even human. They're part mammal, part reptile, part rose, part moon, part wind. And life is a question of which parts are dominant, which in effect possess you. I think most people walk around possessed by the dullest parts of themselves. This, the worst state of possession, is called normal. To be left with a shrunken residue, or to walk around possessed by the dullest parts of ourselves, is a great loss. Rather than enjoying the rich fullness that envelops us throughout our lifetime, we instead inhabit a sense of self that feels cut off from the world. Rilke reminds us, exhorts us, to not lose the world. Ah, not to be cut off, not through the slightest partition, shut out from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it? If not an intensified sky, hurled through with birds and deep with the winds of homecoming. To not be cut off, however, we need to be moving in a rhythm that is syncopated with that of the oaks and willows, heartbeats and touch. We must recall the original cadence of the soul. One of my most memorable teachings about slowing down came from my mentor, Clark Berry, a Jungian analyst with whom I apprenticed following licensure. I was young and I knew I was in need of a mentor, someone who could teach me the art of sitting with others in therapy. The Young Institute in San Francisco referred me to Clark along with other analysts, but when I met him, I knew I was in the right place. Our first meeting over 30 years ago was unforgettable. When we sat down, Clark reached to his left, placed his hand on a large rock lying on the table, and said, "This is my clock. I operate at geologic speed, and if you're going to work with the soul, you need to learn this rhythm, because this is how the soul moves." Then he pointed to a small clock also sitting there and added, "It hates this." What an amazing thing to tell a young therapist. It is the single most important thing I ever learned about therapy, about working with the soul. I share this story with every person I work with. I use it as a means of calming the urgency to change and helping patients return to a rhythm that enables them to listen once again to their own soul. Facing emptiness. The unconscious disappointment that lingers from the failure to receive these necessary elements in our life slowly evolves into a sense of emptiness. Nearly every day in my practice, someone speaks to this feeling of hollowness. And I think how good to name it, to bring it into the room and sit with it. How important it is to keep it in front of us instead of having it trail behind us, out of sight, pulling us away from others and from life. When I first consciously faced my own emptiness, it felt like a sheer drop-off of a cliff. I could not find the way back up. I was floating in a sea of pain and sorrow that had no words. All I could do was try to welcome what came, weep every day, and let those close to me know what I was going through. I needed to tend and care for this vulnerable place. This well of grief was deeper than anything else I had faced in my life, and the terrain was suffered with emptiness and darkness, suffused with emptiness and darkness. There was no one else in this place, no hands to comfort, no arms to hold and support. There was no one else in this place. No other voices could assure me of my connection to the world, I felt utterly alone. Whether or not there is any personal history to this perception is not what is important. What did matter was that I stumbled into this place, and its truth was undeniable. Daily weeping was something I had never experienced before. In fact, I had always been in control of myself emotionally, having shaped a life made up only of the known. I stayed in the well-lit areas at the shallow end of the pool. I kept other people outside safe peripheries. I had built a strategically controlled life in which I was appreciated and respected, but when I plunged into this place of emptiness, it was like a wall that had been blocking my view was shattered, and I could finally see how I was limiting my life in hopes of avoiding the emptiness. For whatever reason, perhaps grace, the lens of my perception was being cleansed by my tears, and I could finally begin to see the layers of invulnerability I had established to keep myself safe and alone. My story is far from unique. Many of us are running away from this hollowness. The courage it takes to face this emotional vacuum is tremendous. I have never been so fragile, so out of control, so inundated by wave after wave of grief as I was when I finally faced the emptiness within, but I am grateful that I did so. It is as though the ocean floor of my psyche shifted and an air pocket rose to the surface of my life. This pocket held precious pieces of my life from times when I could not process the grief, loss, betrayal, and disappointment that was moving through my world. These times had been too much for me emotionally, and so they broke free from consciousness, going subterranean, waiting till the time when I could face them once again. When that emptiness appeared, the arms of community were there to hold me, helping me to endure the terror of that aloneness. It was because I felt held in love that I was able to descend into these places of darkness. My psyche had waited until the vessel was strong enough to take the heat of this confrontation with these pieces of my soul life. Facing our emptiness is key to our freedom. Until we do, we are driven by lifelong patterns of avoidance. It is important to remember that this emptiness is not a reflection of personal failing, but a symptom of a wider loss. When we abandon the old ways established over hundreds of generations, we lost the traditions that made us feel held and embodied. The psychological, emotional, and cultural design that offered us assurance and security in the face of grief or loss has been replaced by a belief system that generates anxiety and a sense of insecurity. Emptiness now saturates our culture. Addictions, consumptions, and materialism are symptoms of this condition. More accurately, they are attempts to cope with the unbearable feelings of barrenness. To be empty, to feel empty, is to live in the wasteland near the gates of death. This is intolerable to the soul. We were not meant to live such shallow lives. Our heritage and our psychic makeup are designed for an elaborate richness of imagination and creativity that allows us to feel intimately connected to the ongoing creation. We were meant to drop below the surface of things and to experience the depths of life in the same way that our deep-time ancestors did. Their lives were filled with story, ritual, and circles of sharing. Their lives were not shamefully hidden away, but known. Losses, defeats, grief, pains, joys, births, deaths, dreams, sorrows. The communal draw of life was open and acknowledged. This is what the soul expected, what it is we need today. A young man of 25 participated in one of our annual gatherings in Southern California. He came filled with the bravado of youth, covering his tracks of suffering and pain through a multitude of strategies. What lingered beneath these tired patterns was his hunger to be seen, known, and welcomed. He wept the most wrenching tears upon being called brother by one of the men. He later shared that he had considered joining a monastery just so he could hear that word spoken to him by another man. During our time together, we held a grief ritual. Everyone there, save this young man, had experienced this ritual before. Seeing these people dropping to their knees in grief broke him open. He wept and wept, falling to his knees. Slowly he began to welcome individuals back from the grief shrine and to feel his place in the village solidify. He was home. He later whispered to me, "I've been waiting for this all my life." He recognized that he needed this circle, and his soul required the singing, the poetry, the touching. Every experience of these primary satisfactions helped to restore his being. For him, this was the beginning of a new life. The fifth gate, ancestral grief. The fifth gate of grief is what I call ancestral grief. This is the grief we carry in our bodies from sorrows experienced by our ancestors. Much of this grief lingers in a layer of silence, unacknowledged. Many of our ancestors arrived in the Americas after leaving their homes, family members, and communities behind. Some arrived here after being abducted and forced into slavery. These generations often survived without a feeling of home, living with only marginal connections with the old ways to guide them. The traditions that had nourished and held their people for hundreds, if not thousands of years, were difficult to sustain on the new continent. They lived betwixt and between the old and the new worlds, attempting to create something that would enable them to endure. Without the protective shelter of the village, they often coped in ways that created a secondary layer of suffering: alcoholism, isolation, rage, and a constrictive silence that cut them off from the living support of others. There was a gap in the dream of what it meant to be human. The rich and nuanced patterns of culture that had evolved over time were replaced with strategies designed simply to help them survive. Gone were the patterns that held myth, song, ritual, and the poetic imagination as the heartbeat of the people. We hold this ancestral grief in our beings, even after many generations in the new land. This sorrow becomes concentrated over time, gathering grief unto itself, and is carried in our psyches unconsciously as a diminished inheritance. The psychic inheritance from our ancestors was meant to be a blessing, but instead it is a layer of heaviness. The stoic facade and behaviors of these generations left behind a legacy of unattended pain. Mayan shaman Martin Prechel says that we are surrounded by the ghosts of unwept ancestors. The truth in this statement is visible in many of the people I see in my practice. Sometimes I will be working with someone who carries a sadness that is hard to identify, but it is there nonetheless. After exploring many possible sources for the sorrow, I often ask if there was something in the family history that might be lingering in his or her body. Following some reflection, there is often a memory of some loss, some wounding that occurred to a grandparent, or some experience of abandonment that resides in the psychic history of the lineage. Sometimes it centers on the great terror and the psychic foundations of a family following the suicide of a child, parent, or sibling. I have worked with a number of individuals who carry the inheritance of this wound. In this place, grief and shame become intermingled, making it difficult to sort through the confusing emotions that accompany the story. These individuals often feel haunted by the fear that this may also become their destiny. One woman I worked with struggled for years with her body image. She held a lingering hatred and contempt for herself. She never felt good enough, pretty enough, or lovable. Something shifted during our work, and the shape of this wound actually intensified. She began to feel disgusted by anything remotely associated with sexuality. She had never felt this way before, but it was now so overpowering that she would not let her husband be near her physically. We explore this feeling from her personal history and from the cultural wounds of women and sexuality. None of this lifted the oppressive weight of these feelings. One day I said to her, "I don't think this is yours. I think this belongs to your ancestors, and it is coming down the generations into your body seeking healing." She thought about this, and something resonated in her body. At that point, it felt that the only way to move this would be through ritual. We talked about some ways she could approach it, and she decided to move forward in the following days. After her ritual, she wrote, "Over the past year, I have been working with parts of myself that have been deeply neglected and misunderstood. There are several of these parts, but I think the one that has most affected me throughout my adult life has been my sexuality or erotic life. I come from a long lineage of frigid women. women who have been taught that it is best to keep our sexual selves deadened and cloistered, women who have been taught that in order to be good and righteous we must above all eschew and tacitly hate the part of us that desires the erotic. I have come to see this story as an ancestral curse. It is an ancient family of lies so paramount and awesome that the erotic lives of generations of women have been destroyed and certainly in many cases never even begun. When my mentor suggested that a ritual was needed in order to break this curse in my life, I was hesitant, to put it gingerly. I was doubtful that something as simple as a ritual could do so, but I've learned that soul work can only be done on a soul level. Leaving my conscious mind out of it as much as I could, I went with instinct when creating my ritual. I somehow knew I needed the earth for this, actual dirt or sand or loam. And I needed water, a large body of water. The earth possesses the energy of the erotic feminine, which is what I was invoking in my own life, and so I knew I needed sacred contact with her somehow. And I felt sure part of this contact needed to be submersion in her waters. I decided to go to a beach during a time I knew would be quite empty. I sat down in the sand and began to write down every bit of the old story I wanted to forget. I wrote without stopping for as long as the thoughts kept coming. My physical body had a pretty intense reaction to this part of the ritual. I began to sweat as I wrote, and I felt so nauseous at one point that I actually had to run to the bathroom. It was as if my body was ready to expel the lies of this curse even before my conscious mind was. With a marker, I then wrote the dominant words of this curse on a large rock and set it aside. Originally, this was my plan for the writing portion of the ritual, but as I sat there, I felt like there was more needed from me. I started to write in my journal again, and out began to pour my deep hidden desires of the erotic feminine in my life. I wrote words and phrases that I had never allowed myself to think about, let alone bring into the world in black and white. This new story turned out to be much more difficult to write than the old. I was embarrassed by my fantasies and shamed by the dirty and inappropriate words I was using. But as I wrote these words, my truth got easier to write. And then they began to flow with relative ease, and the shame and embarrassment I have always carried with them were no longer the principal emotion I was feeling. Instead, I felt excitement and desire and a sort of tinkling energy throughout my whole body. These were subtle and still a bit quiet, but they were there. When my pen stopped moving, I knew I was done with this part. I picked up the rock, took off my cover up, and walked into the waves. I threw that rock as far as I could and then allowed the water to envelop me. Actually, the word I would use is caress. I allowed the sea to caress my entire body, and for the first time in my life, I didn't push the pleasure of being touched out of my mind. I embraced it and laughed out loud. I raised my hands up to the sun and twirled in circles. And then I went and lay on the wet sand, face down. I rubbed every part of my skin against the grainy sand and then rolled over and did the same on my back. I spread out my arms and legs like a snow angel and let myself feel the earth and her energy holding my glorious body. In that moment of sacred contact, I realized that I have the same exact erotic nature as the earth. All of that energy and feminine sexuality is inside of me, and it is my birthright, my soul's duty to embrace and fully live my erotic life. It is strange, really, because I spend much of my time communing with nature, and though I have had many glorious moments of sacred knowing, I have never experienced anything as profound and lasting as I did during this ritual. And what baffles me even more is that I didn't really believe that a simple little ritual I cooked up one afternoon would change a lifetime story of shame, guilt, and denial, but it has. When I stood up from the sand, something had shifted within me. I mean, I was actually standing differently. I felt lighter, fuller, more present in my body, but even more, I felt sexy. And somehow I truly believe that my body is beautiful, perfect, erotic part of me that I get to celebrate and enjoy. It has been 2 months since this day, and however impossible it seems to my conscious mind, I have not once fallen back into the old story. I am 38 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am finally able to look at and touch myself with awe and gratitude. Tending this undigested grief of our ancestors not only frees us to live our own lives, but also eases ancestral suffering in the other world. One young man carried a feeling of shame for which he could not account. We had been working with this issue for some time when I thought to ask one day if there were any stories he knew of concerning his parents or grandparents that might be contributing to his shameful feelings. Almost immediately, his grandfather's alcoholism flooded into his mind. He had never met his grandfather, but there was a curious absence of discussion in the family regarding this important individual. As we talked about him further, he could sense the shame that the family bore about their refusal to acknowledge the man and how that shame had infected him in his youth. He slowly realized that the shame he was carrying was not his, but his family's shame over this man and his struggle with alcohol. Ancestral grief also speaks to the grief that remains in our collective soul for the abuses of millions of individuals. It carries the weight of our genocide of the indigenous cultures that were encountered when European settlers arrived in the New World. It speaks to the shameful legacy of slavery and to the killing fields of the Civil War. This grief carries the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It carries the suffering of many cultures across the planet whose paths collided with the march of progress. All this weighs on our psyches. This grief is so immense, it is hard to reconcile. We have much work to do here as a culture, and it may take many grief rituals and rituals of reconciliation with the Native Americans of this land, with the descendants of the Africans who were enslaved, and at places of death and destruction to begin to heal this lingering sorrow. The long shadow of this violence persists in our psyches, and we need to address it and work with it until there is some genuine atonement for these wrongs. This is clearly part of the sequestered pain that Stephen Levine spoke of that generates the persistent hum of sorrow in the background of our lives. One other facet of ancestral grief revolves around the loss of the ancestors. We no longer look to our ancestors as a source of connection with the invisible powers of the world. In a very real way, we have lost our connection to the land, language, imagination, rituals, songs, and stories of our ancestors, and because of this, we feel homeless. In our obsession with progress and our addiction to the new, this is a grief we deny. It is a grief that comes with the pressures our ancestors felt to assimilate and become part of the American culture and to abandon their connection with the old world. My parents were the children of German immigrants, and they rarely spoke the old language, except when they needed to say something to one another and not have me and my siblings understand what they were discussing. There was a feeling that this heritage and history was something that needed to stay hidden. I felt confused about why this secret special language was not part of my own world. Hearing this loss of our ancestors often requires that we reconnect with our forgotten lineage. Since I began to do so, I have found immense richness in the myths and stories of the ancient Germani and how they lived in direct connection with the living earth. This acknowledgement of my ancestors provided ballast for my life. It restored a foundation that had been missing, one from which I could move more deeply into relationship with the wider world. This is a form of ancestral soul retrieval each of us can do. As we do so, we become better able to set our souls into the soil and become indigenous on this land. There are other pathways of grief, other thresholds that could warrant their own gate. Trauma, as we have seen, is one territory that may need its own gate. When we are exposed to violence, whether in wartime, natural disasters, or the violation of our own integrity in body and soul through rape, molestation, or assault, some part of us splits off in order to survive. While this move is necessary in order for us to keep on living, it also carries a loss of our essential wholeness. Trauma always carries grief, though not every grief carries trauma. Therefore, grief work is a primary ingredient in the resolution of trauma. Ultimately, these gates all lead to the same chamber, the communal hall of sorrows. It makes no difference which door we open, which threshold we cross. Every one of us has grief at each of these gates. When we feel hesitant or uncertain of our worthiness to touch our sorrow, knowing these gates are there offers us a way to connect with our losses, wounds, and disappointments. All too often we deny our grief because it is not as severe as someone else's. How can we possibly compare our sorrows to those who are suffering the horrors of war or the devastation brought about by tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, or intolerable poverty? It is easy to dismiss our grief when we compare it to circumstances we consider to be much worse than our own. But the grief is ours, and we must treat it as worthy of attention. In fact, it is essential for us to welcome our grief, whatever form it takes. When we do, we open ourselves to our shared experience in life. Grief is our common bond. Opening to our sorrow connects us with everyone, everywhere. There is no gesture of kindness that is wasted, no offering of compassion that is useless. We can be generous to every sorrow we see. It is sacred work. Okay, that was a long chapter. On to chapter 4. Thanks for joining me.